History isn't just about dates and dusty books, it's about people, their choices, and the ripples those choices create. To understand the immense story of the Second World War, we must first step back into the world that came before it. The Great War of 1914 to 1918, meant to be the war to end all wars, had left deep scars across Europe. Nations were exhausted, economies were shattered, and a generation of young men had been lost. In Germany, the harsh terms of the Treaty of Versailles created a powerful sense of injustice and humiliation. People felt wronged, and they were looking for someone to blame and, more importantly, someone who promised to restore their national pride. This fertile ground of discontent allowed new, dangerous ideas to take root. In Italy, Benito Mussolini and his fascist party rose to power, promising order and a return to the glory of the Roman Empire. In Germany, a charismatic and terrifying figure, Adolf Hitler, captivated a desperate nation with his Nazi party. He offered simple answers to complex problems, promising to rebuild Germany's strength and create a vast empire for what he called the master race. Meanwhile, far across the globe in Japan, military leaders were also dreaming of empire, believing it was their destiny to dominate Asia and the Pacific. These were the Axis powers, united by ambition and a disregard for peace. These dictators didn't just want power within their own borders, their ambitions were boundless. Hitler began to openly defy the Treaty of Versailles, rebuilding Germany's army and moving his troops into forbidden territories. Other nations, like Britain and France, watched with growing anxiety. They desperately wanted to avoid another catastrophic war, and so they tried a policy of appeasement. They hoped that by giving Hitler some of what he wanted, he would eventually be satisfied, and the threat would fade away. But this only emboldened him, making him believe that he could act without consequence, taking more and more without any real opposition. So, the stage was set for a monumental conflict. It was a perfect storm of unresolved anger from the last war, economic despair that made people vulnerable to extreme ideas, and the rise of ruthless leaders who saw violence as a tool for achieving their goals. The world held its breath, hoping for peace, but the drums of war were beating louder every day. The international community, weakened and divided, seemed unable to stop the inevitable march towards disaster. The lessons of the past were being ignored, and a terrible price was about to be paid by millions of people across the entire globe. The fragile peace of the 1930s was finally shattered on the 1st of September 1939. On that fateful day, without a formal declaration of war, Hitler's powerful German army stormed across the border into Poland. This was not a traditional battle, it was a new kind of warfare called blitzkrieg, or lightning war. It was a terrifying combination of fast-moving tanks, screaming dive-bomber aircraft, and waves of infantry that overwhelmed the Polish defenses with shocking speed and brutality. Britain and France, having pledged to protect Poland, finally realized that appeasement had failed. They gave Hitler an ultimatum to withdraw his forces, and when he refused, they declared war on Germany, officially beginning the Second World War in Europe. Following the swift conquest of Poland, a strange and tense quiet fell over Western Europe, a period often called the Phony War. But this calm was shattered in the spring of 1940. Hitler unleashed his blitzkrieg once more, this time against the West. In a stunning campaign, his armies swept through Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg. They bypassed France's heavily fortified Maginot Line, trapping the British and French armies on the beaches of Dunkirk. The world watched in horror as France, a major world power, fell in just 6 weeks. It seemed as if nothing could stop the Nazi war machine. Hitler stood as the master of continental Europe. With France defeated, only Great Britain stood alone against the might of Nazi Germany. Hitler planned an invasion, but first, he needed to control the skies. This led to the legendary Battle of Britain in the summer of 1940. Every day the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, sent waves of bombers and fighter planes across the English Channel to attack airfields, factories, and cities. They were met by the brave and outnumbered pilots of the Royal Air Force. In their Spitfires and Hurricanes, these pilots, famously called the Few by Prime Minister Winston Churchill, fought desperately to defend their homeland. Their incredible courage and sacrifice prevented a German invasion and marked Hitler's first major defeat. While Britain held on, the war took another brutal turn. In June 1941, Hitler made a fateful decision. He betrayed his ally, Joseph Stalin, and launched a surprise invasion of the Soviet Union. This was Operation Barbarossa, the largest land invasion in history. millions of German soldiers pushed deep into Russia, aiming to seize its vast resources and destroy communism. At the same time, the Nazis were carrying out one of the darkest chapters in human history, the Holocaust. Millions of Jewish people, along with other minorities, were systematically rounded up, imprisoned in concentration camps, and murdered. It was a genocide of unimaginable scale and cruelty, a crime against humanity itself. For 2 long years, the Axis powers seemed invincible, but the war was about to become truly global. On December 7, 1941, a quiet Sunday morning, the world's attention snapped to the Pacific. Japan, seeking to cripple the United States and secure its own vast empire, launched a surprise military strike against the American naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. The attack was devastating, sinking numerous battleships and killing thousands of American service members. President Franklin D. Roosevelt declared it a date which will live in infamy. The next day, the United States officially entered the war, transforming the conflicts in Europe and Asia into one gigantic, interconnected global struggle. The sleeping giant had been awakened. The entry of the United States, with its immense industrial power and resources, began to shift the balance of the war. The first major signs that the tide was turning against the Axis came in a series of colossal and decisive battles. In the Pacific, just 6 months after the shock of Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Navy won a miraculous victory at the Battle of Midway. By sinking 4 of Japan's best aircraft carriers, the Americans halted the Japanese advance and put them on the defensive for the first time. In North Africa, at the Battle of El Alamein, British forces under General Bernard Montgomery decisively defeated Germany's famed Desert Fox, Erwin Rommel, saving the Suez Canal and paving the way for an Allied invasion of Italy. Perhaps the most monumental turning point of all occurred on the Eastern Front, in the depths of the brutal Russian winter. Hitler had become obsessed with capturing the city that bore Stalin's name, Stalingrad. The battle for the city was savage, fought street by street, building by building, in some of the most horrific urban combat ever seen. The German Sixth Army was eventually surrounded and cut off by a massive Soviet counterattack. Starving and freezing, the Germans were forced to surrender in February 1943. The defeat at Stalingrad was a catastrophic blow to the German army and its prestige, from which it would never fully recover. The long retreat back to Berlin had begun. These 3 battles, Midway, El Alamein, and Stalingrad, were the critical hinges upon which the fate of the war turned. They proved that the Axis powers were not unbeatable. They boosted the morale of the Allied nations and their peoples, giving them hope that victory was possible. The industrial might of the Allies, particularly the United States and the Soviet Union, was now fully engaged, producing tanks, planes, and ships at an astonishing rate. The momentum had shifted dramatically. The long and bloody road to victory was still ahead, but for the first time the path was becoming clear. The era of Axis dominance was over. With the tide turned, the Allies began the monumental task of liberating Europe from Nazi control. The beginning of the end for Hitler's Germany came on June 6, 1944, a day we now know as D-Day. In the largest amphibious invasion in history, over 150,000 Allied troops from America, Britain, Canada, and other nations landed on the heavily defended beaches of Normandy, France. Despite facing ferocious German resistance and suffering terrible casualties, the brave soldiers secured a foothold. This successful landing opened a crucial second front in Western Europe, forcing Hitler to fight a major war on 2 sides, squeezing his empire from both the east and the west. From the beaches of Normandy, the Allies fought their way across France, liberating Paris in August 1944 to the joyous celebration of its citizens. At the same time, the Soviet Red Army was relentlessly pushing the Germans back across Eastern Europe, advancing through Poland, Hungary, and Romania. Facing total defeat, Hitler launched one last desperate gamble in the winter of 1944, the Battle of the Bulge, but it failed. By the spring of 1945, Allied and Soviet forces were closing in on Berlin from all sides. Trapped in his bunker beneath the ruined city, Adolf Hitler took his own life on April 30th. A week later, on May 8, 1945, Germany officially surrendered. The war in Europe was finally over. Even with victory in Europe, the war still raged in the Pacific. Japan's military leaders refused to surrender, vowing to fight to the very last person. The Allies faced the horrifying prospect of a full-scale invasion of Japan, which was predicted to cost millions of lives on both sides. In order to force a quicker end to the war and save those lives, the new American president, Harry S. Truman, made a momentous and controversial decision. He authorized the use of a powerful new weapon, the atomic bomb. On August 6, 1945, a bomb was dropped on the city of Hiroshima, and 3 days later, a second was dropped on Nagasaki, causing unprecedented destruction and death. Faced with this unimaginable power and a Soviet invasion of Manchuria, Emperor Hirohito of Japan finally announced his nation's surrender on August 15, 1945, officially ending World War II. The world was left to count the staggering cost. Over 60 million people, soldiers and civilians alike, had perished. Cities lay in ruins, economies were destroyed, and entire nations needed to be rebuilt. In the aftermath, the world sought to create a new order to prevent such a catastrophe from ever happening again, leading to the formation of the United Nations. But it also gave rise to a new Cold War between the two new superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. The war teaches us a powerful lesson about the dangers of unchecked aggression, hatred, and the immense price of freedom.